You're listening to the Forum Podcast, a production of Calvin Theological Seminary.
Aaron and Wendy, welcome to the Forum Podcast. It's great to have you guys here today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's good to be here.
Well, I don't know a lot about lifelong learning, so I will be learning from you as you teach me. I'm excited to have you here. Let's get right into it. Tell me about your backgrounds kind of before coming to Calvin Seminary, and then what brought you here?
Well, the easiest way to say it is a passion for lifelong learning, and that's not just because it's in the job description. But I have a real care and passion for how we learn and grow over time. So I've been always fascinated, even since high school. I looked at some of my high school applications for different programs. Even then I was interested in psychology, and I've always been fascinated about how we learn and grow in life. And decided to pursue that as a career. I didn't even know when I was growing up you could work at a college campus or a university campus for a living. But after I had my own experience on campus, working as an RA and having been mentored by professionals, and I had such a big experience with my faith, with my understanding myself better and socially and all kinds of stuff. It just came together that I thought, it's amazing, I can help others with this. Mm-hmm. And so I worked in student life for a long time, and we don't have time for all the kinds of stories, but lots of stories, as you can imagine, several hundred college students living in the same building. What could go wrong, right? But I learned so much in that experience. But then as I worked in my career in different jobs, I had the same kind of aha that it's not just the college years where you have these big transformations, but in midlife and in work and beyond. And so I kind of clicked and realized, these big transformational changes actually have to happen a lot throughout life. And so that's where the lifelong learning comes in, and my passion for ministry and care about people in ministry, and seeing that for people to sustain their health and effectiveness in ministry, they actually also have to experience transformation. So, so I've experienced it, and I love helping others through that, and there's always something else to learn.
For sure. What was your educational path that kind of got you here? Was it just a bachelor's degree, or did you have to keep going after that to build your credentialing?
Yeah, great question. So in higher education, the field is called student affairs. So think of learning outside of the classroom. And so that's where, you learn a lot in the classroom, but you learn a lot outside of the classroom. So I studied student affairs and higher education, which is a combination of, student development, psychology, some business administration, educational theory. So it's a mix of kind of my favorite things, actually. And so I did that right away, and then that's before I started working on campus. And even then, I wrote a thesis about service learning and experiential learning, and I knew that I wanted to get a doctorate eventually. So I did, later on, a few years later, start a PhD in higher education, adult learning, and lifelong education, kind of a mouthful, but essentially human development over the lifetime.
Yeah.
So I studied that at Michigan State, and again, it was a combination of leadership, organizational change, how adults learn and grow, and what we can do to kind of help adults in those kinds of things, and seeing the whole world as actually like a classroom or a curriculum rather than just a lecture hall. So
I love that.
Yeah.
Wendy, how about you?
Yeah, so I've been here at CTS 3 years, but I'm also an alum of CTS from 2004. So since that time, I've done kind of different vocational ministry roles. So my husband and I served a local church. I was on the ministry staff there. I was a hospital chaplain as well.
I didn't know that about you.
Yes. So always more to learn, see? And then I've also been teaching and leading in colleges and seminaries in that time. So in different capacities, but primarily in spiritual formation, which I'm also a trained spiritual director. So I have a spiritual direction practice, and then I teach in a school for spiritual direction as well. So kind of when I look at that, I think the through line through all of those things was really companioning people in their faith, that's what energizes me. That's what I feel called to do, to be a support, encouragement, listener of how is God meeting people? How are they meeting God? What is that experience? What are they longing for? How can we resource them well? So that's all what lifelong learning is also about. So our program here, really seeks to continue equipping people who are in ministry, helping that to be a sustainable, healthy, life of leadership. I mean, that's really what we're hoping to do.
I love that. So tell me a little bit, Aaron, I know you were here first. Wendy came later. Is lifelong learning something that originated with you, or was someone else kind of piloting that program before you took it over? What was that transition like? And then talk about bringing Wendy on as well, because I'm sure there was a part in that too.
Of course, yeah. So, the seminary has always had things here and there, workshops that they've offered. There's been things that you would call lifelong learning. We have the Center for Excellence in Preaching, the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. So all kinds of things that are categorized as lifelong learning, connect with different centers. But we really wanted to grow that and expand that. And so started an office for lifelong learning and launched several new things and had some ideas. And one of that included expanding the staffing. And so, of course, we are looking for someone to help us with the vision for what a lifelong learning, you could call it a curriculum, but it's more like a set of offerings could be, and someone who had experience in ministry, but also understand the mechanics of how to get programs going. And of course, we found Wendy, and it's been wonderful. We couldn't have launched all these things without her, and so we're really colleagues in growing this program, and work together with two main things, which we'll talk about lifelong learning. But we also direct a program called Empower, which is a whole mentor-based competency approach that's pretty different than a traditional form of education. So, but yeah, that's how it came along. And of course, I kind of lose track of the years, but it feels like she was there from the beginning, even though we just had the concept before that. Yeah.
That's awesome. For those who don't know, and you guys have touched on this a little bit already, but what is lifelong learning? And then maybe more specifically, what opportunities are offered through Calvin Seminary's lifelong learning program?
Yeah, so I think of lifelong learning as an area of the seminary that wants to continue to support people as they go on to vocation, whatever that looks like in Christian leadership, and to continue that equipping that the seminary has done. So some of the things we've offered, over the last couple of years would be like online courses, in-person regional retreats, and then lots of digital resources in terms of podcasts, blogs, articles. We have the lifelong learning cohort, which starts with a 3-day in-person workshop and then continues meeting on Zoom for 6 months. And that's aimed at helping leaders navigate change. So we're trying to do kind of a variety of things, written, video, in-person, synchronous, asynchronous, to really see how we can best connect with leaders. And we're always looking for what are the needs that we can address and pay attention to.
That's awesome. So it's more like, what are the needs we're seeing or do people come to you with ideas, or how does that all work? Or is it kind of a mix of those things?
Kind of both. Like, we have done some surveys. Of course, we have listening sessions. We're in conversation with leaders. You can read reports that are broader than Calvin Seminary about what's happening in ministry, what's happening with Christian leaders. We also try to pay attention to that, those bigger trends, and how can we be part of attending to that.
Yeah. What's one of those trends right now that you guys are seeing that is a big need to be met through lifelong learning?
Well, a lot of what we're seeing, and this is in the reports, kind of the big scale reports that Wendy talked about, is really mental health and resilience and spiritual and emotional health. So ministry in a church or in other settings is quite a difficult profession. As someone recently talked to me, they work with Christian artists, said making money in Jesus' name is dangerous work, actually. And he didn't mean that like making money like you're trying to make money because you're trying to get rich, but the idea of like being paid to offer spiritual care, even when you don't feel spiritually vital, that's hard. And so the research kind of shows that to sustain things actually requires growth and transformation, to have a healthy relationship with your calling and a healthy relationship with your own faith and your own doubt and those kinds of things. So a lot of our offerings have focused on replenishment. They blend kind of some instruction with spiritual practices so that hopefully people are equipped to sustain their call, is really a phrase we like to say. Because it's important work and it's great work, but people just need support. And it's also an approach. Instead of saying, hey, we're going to cram everything we can during your seminary experience, because if we don't get it in now, oh no, what's going to happen? To saying let's provide great preparation for ministry, but then with the assumption that of course you're going to need some support as you go. And just really quickly, some examples. So theologically trained, but then how do I deal with organizational politics? Or how do I lead a staff? Or these very practical things that people can need help with.
Do you have a particular example of maybe someone that's been part of one of your cohorts or, learning groups that's kind of experienced that transformation and maybe a takeaway that they had or something?
Of course, yeah. And I'll jump in, Wendy, and feel free to jump in too. I'll talk about our adaptive leadership cohort, which Wendy alluded to, where it's helping leaders navigate change. And actually the way we help people think about change, because there's change all around us, it's almost cliche to say things are changing quickly because they just are. We teach people about how to lead change by actually figuring out how to make a change in yourself to begin with, and then the method or the approach to how do I change my behavior, because sometimes we want to change our behavior and we actually don't. And so what are the barriers we have? We have hidden barriers to like changing our behavior, understanding things that can help us do that with churches too. So some examples are, as people go through a cohort experience, they realize that they're really hesitant to engage in conflict or to speak up because they're afraid that'll cause some kind of rift that will be irreparable. But through practice and coaching in the group experience, they become less bound by that fear. There's a whole set of practices we borrow from psychology as well as spiritual formation to understand that. So kind of releasing your fear of conflict or kind of holding your identity away from your success, not measuring your success or your identity by your level of success. So a lot of these things kind of in our heads that hold us back. And so working through those things in a group setting can be really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a theme that I've noticed and that your examples point to is a greater level of freedom for leaders to be who they are. So once you kind of look at this struggle and this fear and you unpack it and work through it and pray about it and try some different things, you can just show up more authentically in a lot of situations and feel like, oh, I'm the leader I was created to be. And I don't have to be like someone else necessarily. I can be free to lead in my own style and out of my personality. So that's what I've just noticed as people go through is a new sense of freedom, and that renews a calling too. If you feel like, well, I'm really who I'm meant to be here, and God had intention in placing me in this leadership role.
Yeah, I love that. You guys have already kind of hinted at this, and I'm sensing it with the examples that you're giving, but what makes you excited about this particular type of education and maybe even kind of where you see it going?
Yeah. Well, we both like to directly facilitate. And so just sitting across the table from someone who you can tell is less bound by people-pleasing needs is like, oh, this is great. This is worth the whole thing. So just that moment of like seeing that freedom in people, whether it's over Zoom or in person, and then knowing that can multiply. Because the whole point is, okay, an example of someone trying to help a church be a little bit more outwardly focused and make a culture change. Well, if you're able to be less bound by people pleasing or fear of conflict or whatever it is, you get to show up and you're actually way more effective too. So it multiplies out, hopefully, to an organization. So I think it's the impact. And at the end of the day, all this really is another way to talk about discipleship. So it's just satisfying to be a part of people's journeys and walk alongside of them.
Yeah, I would say the exciting thing for me and what drew me to the role even initially is to make seminary resources accessible to people in an ongoing, continuous way, and to really be supportive of people in ministry. As Aaron mentioned, it can be a really challenging calling, and in the different experiences I've experienced people struggling, and we're like, how can we, as a seminary, be a resource, be a support, be alongside people in ministry? So that hospitality, companioning piece is always very exciting to me. And then, similar to Aaron was saying, I believe very strongly in transformation and the ongoing work of the Spirit. So the reality is that we're always growing, we're always learning, there's always more. And so naming that reality and then kind of living into it with people, I also find really exciting and motivating.
Yeah, I love that. You guys have both hinted at this ongoing relationship of like discipleship with one another and like that seeing that transformation. I have a couple contexts in mind that I would love to hear your thoughts on, but how can Calvin Seminary, you're working, lifelong learning within an actual seminary community. What are ways that, you've seen Calvin Seminary, you'd like to see Calvin Seminary continue to cultivate lifelong learners even within our own students here?
So I was thinking about the mission statement of Calvin Seminary, which talks about preparing people for ministry and offering reformed theological scholarship and counsel to form church leaders. And I think seminary is not only for preparation. This is an important and that we're doing here of ongoing theological reflection, ongoing spiritual formation. And so we don't think of that ending with graduation, and that's not even our mission for it to end with graduation. Today's seminarian is often already doing ministry and is in the context of the ministry they're going to continue doing. So my view is that many of our seminarians are already lifelong learners. And so it's very much part of our context. And then additionally, formation, so much happens in the midst of our ordinary lives. So after seminary, you're going to encounter new situations, possibly a new context, new struggles, new questions. And we want all of that to be part of the ongoing formation, whether it's struggle, celebration, or the mundane. How is this shaping you? How is the Spirit using this in your life? How are you encountering God in this? And how are you meeting other people as they're encountering God in the midst of their ordinary lives?
Yeah, I love that. And I think one of the things that you've highlighted at is, being a continual resource, not just for students here, but for the whole church. And I think we're doing that well already through the forum platform, which I believe you guys are pretty well involved in and hope to continue to be. And I love that.
Right.
Aaron, anything to add in terms of Calvin Sem? Or, because you've talked about churches as well, and I want to hear about that from you too.
I think a few things to add would just be that it requires a posture in the classroom of preparing people to be lifelong learners, and that can come across as the way you explain to people. I'm not here to give you the ultimate answers for everything, but I'm helping you so that you're equipped to continue relearning. So there's a posture in the classroom. But then also a posture, although, as Wendy said, there's this place of reformed scholarship and guidance and expertise, you kind of have to hold that expertise as the institution a little lightly because you have to keep listening. And so you have to listen. Sometimes the answer we think people need isn't what people are saying they're struggling with. And so an approach just requires the institution to listen. And informing what we offer.
What are some of the dangers of failing to listen in that situation?
You heard the phrase answering a question no one's asking. That's kind of what it makes me think of. I mean, we don't want to put our resources into answering questions that aren't significant.
I mean, from a institutional standpoint, it's mission failure. Because if you're answering the wrong questions, you're not actually helping the people you want to help. So even though you have good intentions, you may just be off. So it's mission failure. You become less relevant, and not in a we're popular relevant, but in a this is actually really helping. And so it comes down really to the core of the mission. Or your advice can be off. So I'm at Calvin, but I also do coaching, my own practice. And one of the rules of coaching is you don't tell people the answer. You try to help them figure out the answer by asking good questions. because if you give the advice, oftentimes it's not quite right. And so it requires more of a collaborative approach, which for institutions of higher ed is a new muscle sometimes, that we can still maintain our expertise while listening at the same time.
I love that.
I will say sometimes, of course, you do offer an answer to a question no one's asking to help them learn to ask the question. So I do see that as also, a relevant conversation. But in speaking to the dangers, Calvin Seminary is in relationship with the denomination and the local church, right? We're serving the church and the kingdom. And you think any relationship, if there's not listening, what's going to happen, right? I mean, we just need that communication happening between as we work together and collaborate and seek to serve the church most effectively. If we're not listening to the church, denominational leadership, individuals, we're missing out on what creates a healthy relationship.
Absolutely. And Aaron, you mentioned a little bit earlier about discipleship also within a church context. So I'd be curious, how can maybe a pastor who's listening to this or a church leader who's listening to this foster a culture of lifelong learning even in their own congregation? Not everyone goes to seminary, even though I think it would be really fun if more people went. So how can leaders create that culture of lifelong learning in their own settings, in their own congregations? And how might that even pour out of the work that you guys are doing?
Well, the knee-jerk response is tempting to be, well, we need a lifelong learning program, and we'll set up a formal process for it.
That would also be my response.
Yeah, but that's not a bad response. But it's I challenge people to think about, we're always being learning and being formed, and so it's just a matter of whether we're conscious of the way we're being formed. So I think for leaders, it's embodying that lifelong learning by asking difficult questions to themselves, posturing kind of questions sometimes. And, we've worked with pastors, and pastors are like, well, that's great, Aaron. Our congregations get nervous when you start asking questions. They want answers. So I don't dismiss that challenge, but I think it's embodying it yourself. And I would give the answer of the listening posture too. So sometimes, again, this goes back to being the paid clergy who's got an advanced degree oftentimes, there's so much pressure to live into the role of expert. And your value is tied up in well, I got to give them the answers, and I have to be the expert, and I can't show the cracks. And so almost getting beyond that is what's needed so that people can see that they can also have some cracks too. On a really concrete, practical way, I think it's trying to figure out what people are dealing with in the workplace. What are the biggest challenges? And instead of trying to create something to draw them in, kind of find out where they are and what are the questions they're wrestling with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had some similar thoughts. I mean, primarily, I'd say remembering there's always more. Even in someone with a mature faith, even with someone with years of experience, God has more. Not because of a deficit in the individual, but because of God's generosity and abundance and that life of continued discipleship, with disciple being a learner. And so just like we are not going to say, oh, well, I'm done being a disciple now that I've reached X point, I'm not done being a learner either. I think it does take a culture of some humility and vulnerability. Learning always involves some vulnerability of saying there's something more that I'm seeking after or that I'm asking that I don't have, that I don't know. If we increase our comfort with that vulnerability, I think that creates this culture then of lifelong learning. Also, one of the words in your question, curiosity, I think fostering curiosity. What are the conversations happening in theological education? What are the conversations happening in the church? How do we make sure we're bringing those conversations together? What's new scholarship looking like? What new discoveries are happening? So I think just always being curious and seeing that as a value. And then I had thought of listening as well, listening to the needs of the congregation, listening to where their struggles are. But then I also thought about the space to listen for God, because what is the next step for this organization, for this congregation, for this individual? That's not something, the leader always knows. But if we have space where we're listening, then we're going to hear, what do we need to learn? Kind of what does God have for us?
Something I would add, in my perspective, and it's something we're going to cover in the season here for this podcast, is that, I'm going to oversimplify reality. You're either growing or you're in atrophy or decay. And that can be very slow growth or slow decay, but then over time it starts to show which way you're going. And sometimes the growth and transformation is a matter of survival because life gets difficult. So we're going to talk about burnout in this season. We're going to talk about managing anxiety in a very anxious time inside of us and outside of us. We're going to talk about learning even through suffering, learning even through the process of grief and facing those things. And so there will be troubles. And when that happens, then it's time for us to experience God's grace in a new way and actually grow through those things. And so it's, in my mind, it's like kind of the grow or die, and not in the hardcore, militant way of thinking about it, but it's, life is it's a curriculum, and it's sometimes puts something in front of us and requires us to examine and experience, again, God's grace in a new way or something like that. So I guess the advice, again, I'm thinking about the pastors and the ministry leaders, is to be aware of those moments and learn how to walk with people through those processes.
Yeah, so I would say one other thing would be to recognize the humanity of everyone involved, that being the pastor, the congregation members, the leaders in other capacities, organizational leaders, that everyone as a beloved human needs rest, reflection, space to be poured into. And that's another thing that we hope to provide through lifelong learning. So, in our Empower program, we talk about content, character, and craft. And learning is the integration of those things. So not only new content, but to be formed in new ways in order to practice in new ways. And so we're really caring about the soul of the leader and how can that be replenished and in a lifelong renewal process as well.
I love that. All right, Erin, so you've already teased a little bit about this upcoming podcast season. I'm excited to listen to it. But could you go a little bit more in depth for me about these topics and why and how are they so important to lifelong learning?
Yeah, well, I know there's studies out there that show and demonstrate the number of clergy that leave the ministry and those that are considering leaving, and the burnout rates. And if you look at even since the pandemic, the just jump in anxiety and mental health challenges, that we're awash in a need to understand how to be healthy and resilient and maintain that in order to continue on in ministry. So that felt like a pretty strong imperative to focus on those things. And so we've consulted a professional about anxiety. I talked with a few therapists, and he said, I talk all day about this stuff. Anxiety all day long. So we have some pretty helpful tools about how to manage anxiety that could be helpful for anybody, but especially if people are in ministry. And then, sometimes we're not able to handle things. And if the illustration is trying to tread water, sometimes we go underwater a little bit and experience burnout. And there's studies out there too about risk to burnout that clergy have because of the unique social pressures they have and the expectations to be somebody, and it's hard to live up to those. So who better to tell us than a theologian who has experienced this and come back healthy on the other side. So we're going to say, how in the world did you do that? So trying to trying to gently come alongside people. We're not hitting people, are we?
We're connecting.
Yeah, we're
You're gonna
connecting
connect
with
people.
Alongside.
In one of those surveys we sent out asking about how can we serve you? What do you need? An answer that really struck out to me was someone wrote, I need to duplicate myself. And I really didn't read that as arrogance, there needs to be another me to do this. It was kind of a gut punch for me, actually, of this person feels like they have double what they can do. They need so much more. So they're actually feeling like I'm only doing maybe half. I only have the energy or the capacity to do half of what I need to do. And I think that's where we need that sense of resilience, that sense of what is really important. And Aaron's going to talk, one of the podcasts was about competing commitments. What are the different things pulling at us, and how do we tease those out, and what needs a more volume, a higher volume voice, and what needs a lower volume voice, that we feel like I'm not enough. And of course I'm not saying we're enough without the Holy Spirit. Like, none of us are enough. But yet to feel I need another whole person to carry out my vocation. I think that's a real struggle. And I think that's one people can relate to, though, if we're honest. And I think it was the reality of that comment that stuck with me so much as well. And then just recently I saw ATS sent out a survey of what do pastors rely on most to carry out their vocation, and spiritual practices was at the top of the list. And so we just see such a need of that's that replenishment. Like, how do they put themselves, take Adele Cahoon's words, in the paths of grace? And so I think these topics are also trying to address that sense of the soul of the leader. These aren't specific spiritual practices, but grief and resilience and competing commitments and coping skills all gets at that sort of a healthy interior life and a reflective life that spiritual practices also emphasize and cultivate.
And one thing my pastor said to our congregation a couple of weeks ago is there's this dichotomy of rest and work, where you actually need rest to be able to do work, but rest actually takes work. And so in order to rest or get well, like, you can't there's a trend on TikTok called bed rotting, where you just sit and relax and escape. Like, that doesn't bring you to health. It can remove you from some of the heat, but it's actually going to take some work to get better again. So actually growth is the antidote to burnout. And so you can almost hear the assumptions in that comment about I need to replicate myself. Well, that assumption has to change too about what is necessary. And so that's the deep work that we walk alongside people with, to think about the assumptions that are kind of getting in the way of getting healthy again. Another angle we take, so all this stuff is about self. We're talking about like individuals.
Healthy self.
Yeah, healthy self in relation to our vocation. We also want to give resources to people who are like, hey, I feel like I'm actually doing pretty well over here. How do I help others? And so we've invited a professional coach who has worked in the marketplace and in ministry, been doing this for 30 years before the coaching industry really took off, before it was formalized. Just really talks about how to help people kind of in the darkest, hardest times, and the approach you can take to help kind of pull that growth out of people without just telling them what to do.
Sounds like a fascinating podcast series, and I'm excited to listen to it. I think our listeners will benefit. Yes.
And I got to add one more. We're going to talk about even death, Leah.
Ooh.
I can't get around that. So this concept is of lifelong learning, and our life is our curriculum. Even navigating death ourselves, or walking through the valley of the shadow of death, where those who we love have died, that there's even growth and health in that for us. And so this lifelong learning journey ends when we move on. So there's even gold there.
Well, I will be excited to listen to that episode and all the others that you've recorded for this upcoming season. But in the meantime, thanks for being on the Forum podcast, and thanks for sharing about lifelong learning.
Thank you.
Thank you.